Hello. Today we're going to talk about Antarctica. What's going on in Antarctica? Why all this secrecy? Was there stuff going on in Antarctica around World War II? Did John Kennedy's assassination have anything to do with Antarctica? These are the topics we're going to break down today. Hey, welcome to the show. My name's Molly Elmore. Today we're going to talk about a little bit more of a mysterious topic than generally we cover in this channel. Uh, I have been fascinated with Antarctica for a couple of years now, namely because the official story about Antarctica makes no sense to me. It is full of contradictions, and that is one thing that my mind hones in on is when I hear things that don't line up. My little inconsistency detector goes ding, 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 and it goes off like crazy with Antarctica. Now, and I was sick this week, so my voice is still a little weird. I spent a couple of days just laying around at home reading about Antarctica. I went through an entire 450-page book covering some pretty crazy theories. I'm going to cover some of those today, and I'm not going to cover other of them. So this rabbit hole of Antarctica goes in a lot of different directions and into some things that we'll just call extremely esoteric. And I have no way of validating some of these insane things. So we're going to cover some of the things that I think are easier to confirm with other reporting. These were things that were pretty well sourced in the book that I read. And I'm reading a second one now that has similar level of sources. The first one was on Kindle, so I can't show it to you, but this is my new one that I'm reading, which is kind of fascinating. It's called Empire Beneath the Ice: How the Nazis Won World War II. It's quite a monster of a book. I don't know. I can't hold it up. So anyway, I'll get through that in a couple of days, and probably gonna do a couple of videos on this topic because there's a lot here. So we're just gonna cover level 1 today. And what I've chosen to do is I'm not trying to convince anyone of anything. I've read a bunch of books about this. I've been reading about this topic for several years. I find it fascinating, namely because it's crazy, and two, it's hard to figure out the truth. I can't really go to Antarctica very easily. I don't know anybody who works within the intelligence community who is willing to tell me what's really going on. So we're kind of left with piecing together sources that we can come across and trying to figure out what makes sense and what doesn't. I do think, though, we're going to get to why I believe this later on, that intentional incorrect information is disseminated so that you throw out all of this. It's a pretty effective strategy. Like, if I didn't want you to find out about my secret, but there were sources out there blabbing about it, what I could do is intentionally plant some adjacent theories that maybe are just made up and pretty crazy. And then your cognitive dissonance you'll dismiss all of it because you'll just lump it all together and say, you know what, that whole Antarctic thing is just crazy. I'm not going to believe any of it. So what I'm going to do here is, it's almost like a book report on one of the books that I read this week. And I have some quotes, passages like from the book that we're just going to read together. I'm not saying that this author is these are all facts. Like, this is from the book I read. I'm going to report to you what I read in the book, and then you can make your own conclusions. And this isn't me just trying to be like clever and trying to persuade you to something in a covert way. I'm aware of those games and I'm not playing them here. I'm just simply saying I find this pretty fascinating. It's difficult for me to confirm what is really true, namely because we're going to be talking about some stuff that happened quite a few years ago. And a lot of the people who were involved have, passed away at this point. And secondly, part of the whole story is a cover up. So like the people who know aren't talking. That's the story itself. So this is where we're sort of left to figure out incentives, who had motives to lie, what really seems plausible to me, and what is just even beyond my own like rational, logical stuff. And trust me, I'm open-minded here. Like there's a lot of things that I think are going on in our world that we are unaware of. And I had my friend Fred on the other day. He's worked in military intelligence, and I asked him at the end of it, I was like, "Do you think we will be going to space in our lifetime?" And without hesitation, he said yes. We have Elon Musk and Jed McCaleb building these space projects. Jed McCaleb's building a space station. So, like, the space thing is becoming very real. And so, thinking more about what's going on in space, are other like living beings in space, I think it sort of doesn't do anyone a service to just dismiss all of that outright, because I don't have any friends who are from an alternate universe as far as I know. So it all seems a little bit sci-fi to me to even be talking about this. But I'm at the point where I'm like, you know what? We've been lied to by so much by the media and the government that I'm now open to considering all sorts of things, because why would you lie and go through such efforts to lie about something if there was nothing there? So we're going to go through part of what I've learned today, and you can make your own decisions about, what to believe. Now, I don't know a whole lot about what to do with this information. I talked to some of my husband about some of it, and he thinks I shouldn't do this video at all, that everyone's going to think I'm an outright lunatic, crazy person for this video. So hopefully you won't come to that conclusion, but you may. And if you do, well, my husband warned me and I should have listened to him. Okay. We're going to cover a little bit of basics about Antarctica. Not everybody thinks about Antarctica to the degree that I do, so let's just get up to speed. So there was a treaty formed in 1959. So timing is important in this storyline. So in the late 50s, there was an agreement through 30 different countries that there was going to be no nefarious activity in Antarctica. Specifically, no military activity, no mining, no nuclear explosions, no nuclear waste disposal in Antarctica. It essentially was agreed that it would be for scientific research only, plus some light tourism. And that is the official story that has held to this date. So 30 countries made this agreement. However, a smaller group has territorial claims. And this is a map of how it was kind of split up. And it's sort of bizarre. There's an obsession with the South Pole itself. Everybody wants their land to cut, be adjacent to it. And so it's kind of cut up like a pie. And then there are other islands off the coast owned by some random rich families. We're not going to get into that here, but so it's not all just countries. There are some other groups of people, families, who own some, and they've named the islands after their families. So that's kind of how I figured that out. The largest landowners are nearby, like they're in the southern hemisphere. So Australia has a large claim. Argentina has a large claim. Chile has a large claim. New Zealand has a large claim. That kind of makes sense. They're all sort of in the neighborhood. But then randomly, like Norway has a big one. It's kind of odd. Like, why Norway? Why not Sweden, Denmark? So I don't have the full answer on the backstory on this stuff, because I'm not sure, to be honest, if the backstory is how real it is anyway. The UK has a claim. And interestingly, I kind of thought the US had one, but this map for some reason didn't show that. So I kind of just wanted to show you this to show how the land is kind of cut up. All right. We're going to go back in time now to sort of how the story of some of this stuff came to be. So back in the early 1900s, back when secret societies were being formed, I'm sure there still are secret societies being formed, but this was back then, pre-World War I. This group founded this thing called the Thule Society. Now, Thule shows up a lot in doing your Antarctica research. And I fell down this rabbit hole a couple years ago. Thule came into my head. There's Thule things in Greenland. And then I also will watch any movie that takes place in Antarctica just out of curiosity and interest. And it's strange how a lot of movies that, like the movies The Thing, There's several of the Thing movies. I think I'm talking specifically about the Kurt Russell one and then the newer one that's from the Norwegian perspective. They all got things in there named Thule, so it shows up in the Hollywood version of Antarctica stuff as well. All right, so this Thule Society is founded. This is kind of this secret society of sorts. They have some pretty strong beliefs relating to the occult and superior races. This is sort of a precursor to Nazi stuff that we'll get into in a second. And there's this woman who is a member of this named Maria Orsic, and she is believed to be this very skilled psychic medium who is able to channel information from other beings. Now, whether or not she is actually a psychic who can channel these other beings or not, I don't know. Some people say yes, some people say no. But regardless, the Nazis and the people in this club back then truly believed that she had this ability. Now, these Thule Society members, they believed that the Hyperboreans, who I'm not an expert in that group of beings, they were the progenitors of the Aryan Germanic race. So this was like, they believed there was some kind of civilization pre-humans like us who were the ancestors to this to sort of humans today. Anyway, and this ancient civilization, these Hyperboreans, somehow still exist, and they live inside the earth. They're like hollow earth believers. They also believe that Orsic had these clues about a mysterious force called Vril. When I was reading about this, I kind of had this idea, like this is where Star Wars, maybe the idea came from. And it's this force that can be harnessed by individuals with sufficiently developed mental and psychic abilities. Now, I don't know if anyone had this power, but what the book states is that these people believed that this was all kind of part of it. So they're very into this kind of occult, magical, mysterious stuff. Now, what was interesting about Maria Orsic, and again, this is from the book. I can't verify how true it is, but they claim that she could kind of get these psychic messages from these ancestors or whomever, and they gave her like instructions on how to build like advanced technology things, and she would write these instructions down, I think in a language that wasn't even her own language, and they went and built these things and they like worked. So whoever believed this was pretty convinced that like she was legit. Now this Vril group, Vril, I think hopefully that's how you say it, VRIL. These included some pretty magical abilities, like the ability to heal and change things and all this sort of telepathy thing. So she kind of was embodying this stuff. Again, I'm not going to vouch for her that this was true. This, again, was what the books did. And there was a passage that I did want to read to you. So Maria Orsic channeled these messages from the real people to build a spacecraft. And Professor Winfried Schumann, so Maria was just the psychic. She didn't know how to actually build the spacecraft. So they had this guy, Professor Winfried Schumann, a director of electrophysical laboratory from the Technical University of Munich. He was a member of the Thule Society, and he was tasked with building this spacecraft. So he got the instructions from her, followed them, and built it. Schumann was an expert in high-energy plasma and high-voltage electrostatics, both of which are key elements to the development of exotic propulsion systems for the proposed spacecraft. So this kind of Thule Society, they had a bunch of different members, and one guy was a scientist of sorts, and he takes these instructions and builds her spacecraft thing. Now, this was in the early 1900s, and when Hitler was like a young guy in his 20s. And they ended up kind of recruiting him or finding him to be sort of their spokesman for the agenda that they wanted to push. And they backed him. Like most politicians, when you start out, some older rich person finds you, backs you, helps you in your rise to power. So this Thule Society was behind Hitler. They even kind of bought or founded a newspaper that they used to create the first set of propaganda to support Hitler's message to the citizens in Germany. And then after the war started, so the other thing too, I don't have this covered in detail here, but so they backed Hitler, but then there was sort of a disagreement, and that this Maria woman in the Thule group that she's a part of, they weren't really pro-war. Like they wanted to support Hitler's rise to, because ideologically they believed with him, they're, this sort of Aryan race superiority stuff, but they weren't really interested in extremely destructive war, like bombs and that kind of a thing. So there was a bit of a disagreement there where Hitler was kind of like, well, thanks for the help, but I'm going to go in my own direction now. So anyway, after the war starts, obviously there's a lot of bombing going on. The Allies, the Western forces are bombing all sorts of German facilities in an attempt to win the war. And what the Germans got really good at, and I did not know this until recently, is they built a whole network of underground caves in Germany. And they were big ones, miles, and they were able to build factories under there and store stuff so that if you got bombed on the surface of the land, whatever, your stuff was protected. But I think they realized that there was probably too high of a risk of having all their stuff in Germany. So they started these plans to build facilities of some sort somewhere else. And this is how Antarctica comes into play. And so early in 1939, the German secret societies had decided that their space program would relocate to Antarctica, whose remoteness and deep cavern system under 2 miles of ice, accessible only by submarines, would provide all of that was necessary to build such a program without possible disruption from the impending war. So the idea was Antarctica is in the middle of nowhere, obviously. If you build something that's miles under the ice, no one has any idea. And they could. So while the Thule Society and Hitler had this goal to win the war, they were long-term focused, and they wanted to build these sort of spacecraft where they could visit other civilizations. I don't know if they wanted to look for their Hyperborean people or whatever. They were very woo-woo into this interplanetary thing. So they wanted a place to build these things. Now, whether they built the technology to do this or not, beyond the scope of today's video. What matters, though, for this is that this was their goal, and they went and needed a facility to do that. Now, this is where my open-mindedness becomes necessary, is that they built a whole production facility and residential facilities under the ice in Antarctica, accessible only by submarine. And the story in the book was that Maria Orsic had sort of channeled these location of these caves for the Nazis to find them. Now, it's easy to say this Maria was a fake. She didn't know what she's talking about. She's just pretending. But my question was, well, all right, let's say she doesn't have any legit skills and she's just really good actress or whatever. How did she know where these underwater caves are in Antarctica? Antarctica's huge. It's like double the size of the continental United States. So was somebody just down there driving around in a cave, like looking forever, hoping they might? We were just underneath the ice in Antarctica, looking around for a cave, hoping maybe there would be something down there where you could build factories. Like, why would that even occur to you? I mean, this is back in the early 1900s. Like, they didn't have the technology to sort of be able to see down there. So that's where I'm like, all right, there was somehow she or the Nazis found out that there were these caves under there. And that's where there's like the possible that yes, she was given some instructions by some other being, or she got lucky, or some other thing I haven't thought of. So that's just an interesting question I have, is how did they know? Like, who drives around under Antarctica in a submarine randomly looking for caves, hoping maybe that'll work out? That seems like a really wild goose chase to do unless you had some kind of a solid lead that was a viable thing. So we're getting into some of this more esoteric stuff, but we're going to go back now to the political thing. Okay. So the Nazis now, they set up their base. They were good at this. They had done it in Germany. They're very organized in logistics. If you've ever seen like Raiders of the Lost Ark, kind of impressive the operations that these very militant Nazis would run. Now, I'm not in any way pro-Nazi at all. I'm just trying to figure out what's going on in Antarctica. They did lots of bad things in Germany, horrible things we know about via the Holocaust. There was apparently also incredibly huge underground slave population also working underground that no one knew about. And a lot of these people might have been moved by the Nazis to Antarctica to continue their slave life. Because the thing that Nazis like about slaves is that they're not going to blab. Where if you had a low-wage worker who went home at night and you had this low-wage worker do something shady, they could maybe blab to their family or to their neighbors or whatever. But if everybody's just a slave, they don't leave or go anywhere, then you don't have to worry about any leaks. So they had this sort of logical reason why it just made more sense to have slaves than to have workers. I don't think it was about money as much as silence. All right, so what were some of the goals of this Thule Society Nazi German Navy in Antarctica? So they had 3 goals according to this book. Number 1 was to locate and convert vast caverns found deep under the Antarctic ice into fully equipped bases that could host large numbers of personnel and equipment. Goal number 2 was to establish large manufacturing plants in Antarctica for building fleets of spacecraft capable of interplanetary flight and eventually interstellar flight. And I realize I'm not totally clear about the difference between interplanetary, from planet to planet, and interstellar. Maybe that's from solar systems. Okay. Number 3, establish Antarctica as a safe haven from the vicissitudes of another European war. So they wanted shelter, they wanted a place to build stuff, and they needed also space to store equipment so it would be safe from bombings. All right. After World War II, Hitler supposedly dies, right? Well, there's a lot of chatter, and including in this book, that, and I'd heard this for years, that Hitler did not die, and that he faked his death, and he left and went somewhere. And there's sort of 3 places he may have gone. He may have gone to all of these places because he didn't have to go, he didn't go to one place and stay there forever. Some say he fled immediately to Antarctica and just sort of hid out there for a while. The book also says he lived in Colombia, South America for a while, and that he also lived in Argentina for a while. And he may have had more kids, which is interesting. And he may have lived a life, in Argentina as just a regular guy, for all we know. Interesting. But I don't find it hard to believe that here you are in this war. You've pretty much given up that you're going to lose. You build this sort of getaway so you can continue your long-term goals. But if everybody thinks you're like the biggest enemy in the world, as long as people think you're alive, they're going to keep hunting for you. So why not fake your death? And then everyone thinks you're dead, and then you can move on. And in the new book that I'm reading, it kind of even covers how neither the USSR or the American president, no one believed it. They all thought it was a little bit too convenient. So Hitler goes, let's just say he went to Antarctica immediately after the war. They're now continuing building their high-tech stuff, working on their long-term goals. Well, the United States wants to know what's going on down there. We think the Germans got a Nazi facility in Antarctica, but we don't really know the deal. So they found an admiral in the Navy who had been down there before, and they sent him down there through what is called Operation Highjump. Now, this is hardly a conspiracy theory. You can go and read about it on I think I have even a screenshot. Read about it on Wikipedia. Like, this is well documented. What is not well documented is the true mission of Operation Highjump. It was labeled to be a scientific research operation. However, they sent almost 5,000 people, 13 ships, aircraft carriers, multiple planes down there. Part of the mission was classified. If it were really just a sort of nothing burger research project, why do you need to send that many people? What are you researching in Antarctica right after World War II that's so pressing you have to send this much stuff? So the official reason was that Operation Highjump was to establish the Antarctic research base in Little America 4 for the purposes of training personnel and testing equipment in frigid conditions and amplifying existing stores of knowledge of hydrographic, geographic, geological, meteorological, and electromagnetic propagation conditions in the area. So, all sorts of testing and research. Again, that's a lot of people to send down for some just training and testing of equipment in cold conditions. So I don't really buy that story. And I don't really need to buy that story because what happened was Admiral Byrd and some of his military colleagues, they went on a scouting mission for what I do believe is the real mission, which was to figure out what the German Nazis were doing there. And they were flying along and they were attacked. They were attacked by, they weren't exactly sure because here you are flying along and someone starts shooting at you. You don't necessarily know who it is right away. And they were attacked by some pretty advanced tech, things that sort of what we would refer to as like a laser or like an energy weapon, which back then in the 40s, like nobody had that kind of thing. So that was sort of bizarre. And there also seemed like, so Admiral Byrd wrote a diary, which was released after his death. So we do know about what he says happened. This isn't just me making this up. There also were some accounts that there was some technology that Admiral Byrd didn't even really understand that we sort of have seen in like sci-fi movies since then, where if you're flying along and you hit like an invisible shield, it like vaporizes you. So that's sort of like some of his planes look like they spontaneously blew up, but it kind of looked like what we would consider maybe he flew into some sort of invisible barrier thing that you would see in like a sci-fi movie. Now, this is where it gets really interesting, which is where my Admiral Byrd fascination really came from, is he's flying along in Antarctica where it's really, really, really cold. And all of a sudden flew somehow, looks like actually through the floor of the earth, through the surface of the earth. And all of a sudden he's in a more temperate climate. Like it's not cold, it's warm. And there's a lake, which isn't frozen. And he's now, then he gets attacked by all these other enemies, whatever you're going to call them, like assailants. And he ends up turning around, leaving, and the battle is over. And there may have been some kind of negotiation at some point because he packed up and abruptly left weeks before this mission was supposed to conclude and went home. And what's interesting is that on his way home, he stopped in Chile and gave an interview to an article, to a reporter, and an article was written about it. And the interesting thing about the article is he basically said directly to this reporter that our next sort of attack from the enemy is going to come from a group of people who have the technology to fly from pole to pole quickly, which implied that it was way more advanced technology than the US military had at the time. Now, when he got home back to US, he was abruptly told to keep his mouth shut. The thing about this article down in Chile was that it was in the newspaper and it was harder to, silence that kind of stuff back then because the newspaper went out physically. Whereas on the internet era today, you could just get the article taken down. That didn't work as easily. So there were still sort of remnant copies of this Chilean article with Admiral Byrd's statements. Now, he was silenced and I think even discredited. But after he passed away, his nephew released this diary, which you can actually, I bought it off Amazon. You can read it yourself if you want. All right. Then there came Operation Paperclip. So this is where sort of the foundation of something very nefarious comes to play. And again, Operation Paperclip is not a secret. It is also on Wikipedia. The idea, though, was that after World War II, the German scientists who had worked on a bunch of technology projects were hired by American firms. Apparently, other countries also hired some of these German scientists, and they worked in things like the aeronautics industry, the rockets industry, that's a thing, NASA, what we would refer to now as the military industrial complex type of businesses. Now, at first glance, it seems like why would you do that? I thought the Nazis were our enemy. Why would you go and hire all these people who worked for the enemy and let them work in our military industrial complex? This is where the ties get very murky. And it's like, well, how do you define enemy and who's enemy? Because if you go back to before the war, there were some business relationships between US companies, some US banks, US manufacturing businesses, between the Nazis and these companies. Like, IG Farben is a great example of one that did business with the Nazis, and there was sort of a technology relationship in addition to a financial relationship. And Hitler wasn't really labeled the enemy until sort of further along. So it gets to be very unclear about whether the labeling the Nazis was sort of a public policy versus what was actually really going on, because these German scientists who were involved in building some of these advanced technology things, again, let's go back to what was really going on in Antarctica, what types of technology were they really building, and the US didn't want to get left behind. So they said, hey, maybe we can hire a bunch of these guys. And what I end up concluding after reading all of this is it was essentially, if we can't beat them, join them type of thing as well. And that, let's say the Germans had figured out through, I don't know exactly whether it was really good scientists, they had some sort of divine intervention or whatnot, but they had some advanced technology that the US wanted. So this is where the whole kind of scandal comes to play is, I think we'll get into this next slide. Did Truman make an agreement with the Nazis that we would sort of work together and that the military industrial complex would become open to German scientists infiltrating it? And there would be kind of a partnership of sorts. And this would all become the basis of the secret space program. And that the German Nazis and these large US manufacturing companies who have access to US money and banking money would essentially work together in these Antarctic bases. All right, I'm going to read to you from this article. So the secret agreement allowed the Antarctic-based Germans to infiltrate the US military industrial complex. After the treaty was signed and the joint secret space programs began in earnest, things quickly got out of hand, and the Nazi breakaway group won the race to infiltrate and take over the other side. So there was sort of also, like we have with these cartels, there was a bit of a fight. They didn't all have their goals aligned. Now, this one group that's kind of what we're going to call the dark group, in the terms of that their goals were sort of nefarious and selfish. They're hardly like do-gooders. They soon controlled every aspect of the U.S., from the financial system, the military-industrial complex, and soon after, all three branches of government themselves. So what is sort of fascinating is that they used this leverage they had, which was this advanced technology, which they might have just basically been able to say, we're also going to, if you don't do what we say, we're going to just blow up the United States. Like, I don't know what the leverage was in this agreement, but the end result appears to be that Truman sold the US out, and said, you can have access to all of these components. Now, there was obviously more people involved than just the president, and there was people in the intelligence community who wanted this as well. So it looks like this military industrial complex plus the intelligence community, the three-letter agencies, plus the financial system, plus government, all became what we, sometimes we call this like the deep state, this group that were all working together for their own purposes, not for my benefit or your benefit. I'm pretty confident in that. And this essentially started with Truman. And there was some kind of thing that happened with Admiral Byrd that forced this hand. Because after another thing happened that is a little bit esoteric out there. After the Admiral Byrd Operation Highjump, a bunch of strange vehicles flew to Washington, D.C. and were like hovered above the White House. And a lot of people apparently saw this back then. They were there for a while. And this scared Truman and appears to be some sort of spark that forced this negotiation. Now, who was driving these things? Some people say it was actually just German Nazis who had figured out how to make these cool planes and had driven them up there. So I don't know. So this now becomes the foundation of the big secret. This is the lie that has been propagated for a while, was that they had also received intelligence from their paperclip spies. So the paperclip people, the German scientists, were now everywhere, but they still were loyal to the Nazis. So now it was hard to do things without the Nazis knowing. So you couldn't like break away from this deal. They'd also received intelligence from the paperclip spies that the Americans had implemented an executive order making the existence of alien life the most classified subject on the planet. Now, I have read that idea in several books. And if you even think about some of the like Roswell stuff or Area 51 or whatever, I don't know what happened there or what they found or what's going on, but what I am pretty confident of is that it's a very guarded secret. Like, this is a very taboo topic to discuss with military people. I've asked some people I know in the military, and it makes them uncomfortable because I think it's very clear that this is not a topic that people are supposed to be discussing openly. And I'm like, why? What are you hiding? And while you could say, well, they're just trying to protect us, I don't buy that. Or it's just classified. Okay, but why? Well, what if it really comes down to the fact that there has been kind of collusion between these factions within the US and probably the British and the German Nazis for since the 40s? Like, this idea that we were enemies and we beat them, and this story about winning World War II, is that totally made up, and that was really more necessary to reset the financial system and implement Bretton Woods? Because it doesn't really look like the Nazis really lost. They just sort of moved and set up a new arrangement. Maybe their operations in Germany were bombed, but okay, they seem to have recovered. The reason being that the development and release of alternative energy would quickly destroy the oil trade, and therefore soon the entire Babylonian money magic slave system that the elites used to control the masses. So there's some other things that happen if you look at this sort of big picture of post-World War II, is we had these Germans who figured out this very cool new ways to harness energy. Well, this was the time before like car industry really took off. Was that intentionally suppressed to make sure that sort of Standard Oil and the Rockefellers got their monopoly on oil that wasn't messed with? We've seen that sort of alternative energy options have been suppressed since early 1900s, when they had figured out back then how to make a car run on water. Was that intentionally suppressed to keep money-making operations going? And so it kind of does point to this collusion of financial interests and this sort of money system that kind of ties to it, all sort of being a part of this. And the secret, though, to me, is not that as much as the fact that there's been this collusion for almost 100 years that is flat out makes the World War II story that we've taught in school like basically a flat out lie. All right. There was a little bit of scope creep. I'm going to read this one for you because I found this one fascinating. It was a very effective and silent coup that gutted what was once the American public and turned it into a corporate entity, with each of us being assets with our very own serial numbers. This plan was in action before World War I by various secret societies who controlled the financial system and, as many know, financed both sides of the wars. Due to the secret deal reached between the Eisenhower administration and the Fourth Reich, German scientists brought in under Operation Paperclip were not allowed to be under Army surveillance, thus making them ideal assets for the Fourth Reich. The Germans dominated the rocket program to such an extent that they held the chief and deputy slots of every major division and laboratory. So these Nazis were almost like a parasite type thing, where they just sort of infiltrated everywhere and took over and really locked on their stronghold. And they had a lot of partners in the business industry who maybe were aligned with German stuff, maybe not, I don't know. they certainly had the same nefarious agenda to be deceptive and profiteering off of a lie. All right. Does it seem like a far-fetched idea that this sort of like they built these caves in Antarctica to build these advanced weapon factories? At first, I'm like, yeah. But then apparently they had something very similar going on in Germany. So, regarding the possibility of Germans building self sufficient underground research factories in the Antarctic, it has only to be pointed out that the underground research centers of Nazi Germany were gigantic feats of construction containing wind tunnels, machine shops, assembly plants, assembly planet launching pads, supply dumps, and accommodation for all who worked there, including adjoining camps for the slaves, and yet very few people knew they existed. So this was not their first rodeo in terms of building these types of facilities. Obviously, Antarctica's far away. You don't have, you can't run out to restock that quickly, but the Germans were very good at planning and logistics and worked on these plans for years before they had to move down there after World War II. All right, JFK, how does he fit into this? All right, so John Kennedy's dad, Joe Kennedy, was a former ambassador to Great Britain. He also was the first chair of the SEC. He was part of that elite group. He had been an early supporter of Nazi Germany, where most of these money guys back then in the sort of 1920s era were. Just as Joseph Kennedy had made a deal with the Italian mafia to support his son's 1960 election, he also reached a similar deal with the Fourth Reich. So this is, similar to deep state cartel stuff now. They're all kind of making deals with each other, supporting each other's candidates. Apparently there weren't really like honest elections back then. They just were maybe manipulated in a different way. Now here's where JFK got in trouble though. So he was trying to be a good president. I do think he actually had genuine intentions. He wasn't necessarily concerned with the deal that his dad had made to get him elected. And he wanted to create a peace treaty with the Soviets. However, this is what happened. If cooperation with the Soviet Union were to be established in the international arena, then it would significantly reduce the power of the military-industrial complex. More importantly, cooperation with the Soviet Union would undercut the power of MJ-12 and the Fourth Reich. So if you think about the military-industrial complex as a faction of the Nazis, you can see why they never want peace, because if your job is to make weapons, you want there to be as much conflict constantly as possible. This is why people have argued they never wanted peace in the Middle East, and that there's always some kind of war going on somewhere, why the Afghanistan-Iraq thing dragged on for 20 years. It's very likely here that nobody actually wanted peace because the military-industrial complex wanted to make money. All right, Kennedy was therefore directly confronting the CIA over its ultimate control of the classified UFO files. All right, so what Kennedy had done is he had asked the CIA to release to him all the stuff about what's going on in Afghanistan. They called it the UFO files, but it really was about this secret space program and what they were building down there and who was involved. And if that had come out, it could expose this whole military-industrial complex agenda. And he was going to share it with the Russians, and basically their whole scam would be up. So Kennedy was therefore directly confronting the CIA over this ultimate control of these files and attempting to expose the existence of the Fourth Reich's Antarctic space operations. The trigger was Kennedy's fateful agreement with Khrushchev on November 12, 1963, on space cooperation that led to Kennedy's top secret memo instructing the new director of the CIA, John McCone, to share all UFO information with NASA. The assassination of President Kennedy was the direct result of efforts to gain access to the CIA's control of classified UFO files. Sorry. I just saw a clip this morning on Tucker Carlson that he was on Fox News talking about CIA's involvement in Kennedy's death. I was like, wow, that's so funny. I just working on this video for that same thing. So this news appears to be making the rounds right now. So I wouldn't be surprised if you hear about this elsewhere, that the CIA was involved in Kennedy's assassination, which I've heard for a long time. I wasn't really clear why, because I'd heard from sort of Creature from Jekyll Island stuff that, Kennedy also wanted to get rid of the central bank and he wanted to return us to sound money. And I'm like, all right, that makes sense. But is that really the CIA's like purview? Like, is that going to be the battle that they fight, the issue over the money supply? Maybe. It just doesn't seem like that would be their thing. However, if they are essentially part of the military industrial complex, the CIA is an extension of this group or representing their specific interests, covert military operations, creating wars, coups, that kind of thing. This actually makes a lot of sense that if Kennedy had been successful in creating this peace agreement and therefore unearthing this Nazi Antarctic secret space program to the Russians, it would have been a big problem for them. So they killed him. All right, cover up. I mean, this era was when the idea of conspiracy theory was introduced by the CIA as a way to discredit people talking about Kennedy's death. I actually grew up, my dad was fascinated with Kennedy's death, and I didn't really know why or what he thought it was. I just knew he had every book you could get about the assassination. I remember listening to relatives when I was very young talking about the magic bullet theory and sort of whether there was two shooters. So they were very fascinated, I think, with the logistics of was it even possible for Lee Harvey Oswald to have killed him? There was a lot of doubt, even back in the 80s when this was being talked about. But what I'm more concerned about or interested in is the motives. Why? What was such a big deal that he would kill an American president? I mean, that's a significant thing to do. Like one of the biggest crimes you can probably do in the world, right? Is to kill the leader of a head of state. So they developed some tools. And what I found fascinating that I read in this book was that, a lot of this book does cover sort of, esoteric alternate life form type things. And it kind of reminded me of these sort of magazines or newspaper things you see at the grocery checkout with these sort of crazy stories about, UFO landing in someone's yard or, alien abductions. And it said here in this book that the National Enquirer was actually created intentionally as part of this world. Its chief purpose was to hide the truth in plain sight by releasing it in sensationalized news stories with questionable sources that would be widely ridiculed by the general public. So those news sources, I guess it was the National Enquirer specifically, they wanted you to learn about these things, but immediately dismiss them. The same way that right now, if you hear something that's sounds a little crazy, the minute somebody calls it a conspiracy theory, it gets dismissed. Like, oh, don't stop believing that. That's just a conspiracy theory. Well, who decided that? Sometimes there's a concerted effort, and publications like the National Enquirer were created for that specific purpose. Now, again, I'm going by what this book said, so I don't know if he's lying about the National Enquirer or whatnot. All right, so the other thing that's interesting is that the military industrial complex continues to have a presence in Antarctica, in spite of the fact that there's very clear rules that there can be no military operations and there can be nothing to do with weapons down there, that it's for scientific research only, as well as light tourism. Well, why do Raytheon and Lockheed Martin both have contracts for scientific projects in Antarctica right now? Well, I mean, I'm not an expert on Raytheon, but my understanding is that they are a weapons manufacturer. They're not in the science things. Are they down there counting penguins and worrying about the ice melting for climate change? I don't know. So that was interesting to know. Now, one of the things we learned from Edward Snowden was that very often covert military operations will be conducted under the cover of something more benign like a research project. So it doesn't surprise me that these more secretive projects would be done under a fake cover. Like we've already been told that kind of thing happens. And the question then I had, that I didn't have a slide for this, but how do you live under Antarctica if it's so cold? Like how is there this lake that Admiral Byrd saw? And one thing that's kind of come up is that there are a ton of underground volcanoes in the area. And the volcano, let's say if it was spewing steam into this underground cavern, it creates these temperate, almost tropical like conditions where life and plants can thrive. And that is probably what is causing the ice to melt in Antarctica, is that there's hot water underneath Antarctica, which causes the ice to melt. So it's kind of a clever charade that they've convinced people that it's your car in Europe or your cow for burgers in Wyoming that is causing the Antarctic ice to melt via this climate change stuff. So it is true. I think that the ice is melting in Antarctica, but it's because of these underground volcanoes. I saw like a graphic of where all these, there's tons of these volcanoes under there causing ice to melt. So don't feel bad about driving your car and that it's hurting Antarctica. It's not. All right, so that's all I have for video number 1. This sort of crazy realization that there is likely some manufacturing at facilities going on. Now, it's also a lot more dark stuff that I don't know how to verify right now, but that there's a lot of people who are forced to live under there and work in these conditions. And that if some of these military, excuse me, and some of these military industrial businesses are participating in that stuff, that's pretty bad and dark. And what kinds of research are going on down there, we don't really know. It's all kind of covertly covered by these national agreements that people like us are not allowed to go snooping around up there. There's a no-fly zone over Antarctica. There's no Google Maps for Antarctica. And the question becomes, all right, if it's such a beautiful, pristine place, why can't we at least see what it looks like on Google Maps? And I haven't checked recently. I know you couldn't before. It all just sort of showed up as a nothing burger. And the question becomes, well, maybe there are either buildings there or there are large openings that you can go to fly into this more temperate underground stuff that is being kept warm by these volcano things that are like, if it sounds kind of crazy, think about Old Faithful in Yosemite. Sort of this steam thing, right, that shoots up. That only comes up, I don't know how often, but not all the time, like daily, maybe every couple of days or something. I'm not sure. But the idea is that it is this sort of underground water thing introducing very hot water. Imagine if that was being done well under the ice in Antarctica. You could see that it keeping the environment down there temperate enough for life. So that's what I have about Antarctica. If you have any thoughts, share on this or other connections. There's a lot of things in this that I did not get into that I will maybe do in a part 2 video. When I get through my next book on this, I'll probably have some more to share. I think just in summary, I do firmly believe there is way more going on there than we are led to believe, whether it is this nefarious collusion with the military industrial complex and the Nazis. I don't know how to confirm that, being that I don't have any friends who are Nazis or in the military industrial complex. Maybe I will try to make some just to confirm this story. But I think that this is fascinating and I will continue to do some research. Going to Antarctica is on my bucket list, but my understanding is unless you're an insider in these industrial capacities, which I'm not, I could maybe go on a cruise for like $15,000 and like wave at the penguins from the shore and maybe walk along a little tiny strip in the very, allowed area where I'm not allowed to go into some of the more inland places that are no-fly zones. So I will continue to watch every movie about Antarctica that I can as well. It hasn't been a good one in a while. The Thing ones are probably the best. Alien versus Predator is a pretty bad one. I have seen that several times though. There's a Kate. Can't remember her name. There's a couple other pretty bad ones as well. But if you have any Antarctica movies that you really liked, let me know. I'll watch them because I have to scour for references to Thule and any other hints that Hollywood sometimes leaves us. So this is really just for fun. I'm not trying to convince anyone of anything. I find this subject fascinating. If you think it's crazy and out there, no worries. You can go watch different videos in your spare time. If you did like this, I do really appreciate it if you'd like the video. That helps me out a lot. Subscribe to the channel to catch the next one. There'll hopefully be a part 2 on Antarctica coming soon. And I appreciate you. Thanks a lot. Have a great day.